a co-founder of the Asian American Feminist Collective. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York right now. And about AAFC, the Asian American Feminist Collective, which I'm assuming is part of the reason why y'all are here. Maybe you found us on Instagram or something. But we are, oh, sorry about that. Having a little technical difficulty. Okay, yeah, so we are Asian American feminists. We engage in intersectional feminist politics grounded within our communities, which include those whose backgrounds encompass East, Southeast, South Asian, Pacific Islander, multi-ethnic, and diasporic Asian identities. If you identify as an Asian American feminist, you're in the right place. And through public events and resources, we seek to provide spaces for identity exploration, political education, community building, and advocacy. And so that is one of the things that we're going to get done here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pass it off to my co-leader, Senti, who will be moderating the conversation to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight and sharing your evening with us. My name is Senti Sojwal, and I am a co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective along with Tiffany. I'm just looking through where everybody is zooming in from, and it's so awesome to see people on the West Coast. We have someone in Korea, we have someone in Miami, Providence, LA. So I will say one weird blessing of the Zoom times is that it's really cool that we get to expand our community and do events like this where we get to have people from all over. So I want to wish everyone a happy Valentine's week. Time to celebrate love in all its forms, to think about pleasure, happiness, joy, how we can cultivate those things together. I'm so excited for this event tonight and the amazing panelists that we have. I want to talk a little bit about how this event came to be and what some of the thought process is behind it. So for those of you in New York who have been coming to AAFC events for a while, you might know that we have an annual Sex and Love Talk Circle event that we usually have every February around Valentine's Day. And so we really wanted to create a space that was really intimate, where we could bring people in to have really candid, facilitated conversations about sexuality, pleasure, desire, gender identity, what our sex ed experiences were, where they were lacking, what kinds of lessons we had to unlearn growing up as people of color, navigating sexuality, our identities and relationships. And so we've found that this is an event that really speaks to people, and a lot of people who've attended have said things to us like that they have never really had a space like this before to be able to talk about these issues with people who share their identities and share their community. And so knowing that Zoom was not maybe the best place to have a conversation where we invite people to really bear it all and talk about their most intimate sexual desires and fears, we still wanted to do something around Valentine's Day where we could still explore a lot of these topics that are so pressing to all of us and so important. And so the thinking behind tonight's event, Decolonizing Sex Ed, we have brought in two really incredible sexuality educators that I'm so excited to introduce to you. And so we're really going to be talking about the sexuality field in general, how it upholds white supremacy, how it fails people of color, why it's so important to think really critically about non-hegemonic and ancestral narratives about sexuality, what we feel like comprehensive, queer, inclusive, radical sex ed can really look like in our communities, how we can cultivate that, how sex ed is a racial justice issue, and how we can expand our capacity, each one of us, for understanding love, sex, and pleasure. And so we are going to have a panel discussion with our two panelists, and then there will be time for Q&A in the second portion of the event. So as we go, please make sure that you're writing down your questions. We would really love to hear from all of you and engage with you. on these topics. And so, yeah, we will have time for Q&A at the end. And I am really excited to now introduce our panelists to all of you. So first we have JV. JV is a Newark native, Indigenous, first-generation child of immigrants. JV began working in sex ed over 10 years ago with Masakane, a youth-driven and community-based organization promoting sexual liberation, including the right to pleasure for marginalized communities. JV is a facilitator of adult sex ed programming, including for Spanish speakers, adults with IDD, and older adults aged 55 plus. JV has led workshops on environmental racism and SRJ in community, and as a speaker for the Sexual Liberators Movement virtual conference. You can find JV and the memes that they love on Instagram at jvulva. Sandra Fanita Kumwong is a Thai American of Mon and Teochew descent, born and raised in the New York City metropolitan area. She's a full spectrum doula, gynecological teaching associate, and a sexual health educator. Sandra is an aspiring physician with the goal of practicing sexual and repro health from a reproductive justice lens. When she isn't consuming 4 different social media platforms at a time, I feel you, girl. She enjoys playing Stardew Valley, bird watching, and cultivating her indoor garden in her Queens apartment. So let's get into it. I would love for each of you to tell us a little bit about the work you do and what drew you to becoming a sexuality educator. Maybe we can start with JB.
Hi folks, everyone can hear me? Thumbs up or anything in the chat? Great, I'm always gonna triple check. So yeah, I get this question a lot and I think my answer is changing constantly. I started doing sex ed when I was in college, but these conversations about sex ed and sexuality have actually been happening forever for a lot of us, and maybe we haven't really thought about it. I was in community college and I was approached, or rather I approached the table with Masakani, the place that now I am on the board and help with fundraising efforts and with a lot of things on the project. So I just started talking about sex ed a long time ago, 10 plus years ago. And it was something that I was drawn to because I didn't know it was possible to do. And once I started doing it, I realized that the conversations that I was lacking growing up are something that a lot of people can echo, that a lot of us don't have these conversations. And even now, as an educator in a lot of different communities, I still find that there's so much space for admitting that I don't know. So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Oh, wow, I'm so nervous right now. Hey, so I guess I also have a very similar answer where I think I've been talking about health for a long time, like unofficially. And that kind of started when I was navigating a disability as a child. I was in a car accident when I was in fourth grade. And ever since then, I developed this like mystery pain disorder, and it really just landed me in a lot of different doctor's offices, a lot of different medical settings in general. And then from that point on, it's just I had to learn how to advocate for myself and kind of navigating the barriers that my family faced. Like I was the one who was advocating for myself. Like my mother was just kind of there. I was the one like looking at insurance forms and all this stuff. So then when in high school, as more people became sexually active, like my friend group, it was pretty easy for me to, as easy as it could be, to navigate sexual health. And I just kind of became that person for my friend group. And it's funny because I see a lot of my friends here. So I'm just, so it comes full circle. And so I became a peer educator with a health ed organization in college called Peer Health Exchange. It landed me in different places. I worked for Planned Parenthood for a little bit. From there, I became a full spectrum doula, mainly doing abortion support and abortion education. And now I'm a gynecological training associate, which means I use my body and anatomy as a teaching tool. And I play a teacher and a patient with pelvic exams and breast exams.
That is so cool. I love hearing about both of your experiences and your lives. So, as both of you know, in this country, you're pretty lucky if you get any kind of formal sex ed at all. But the sex ed that most of us do get is really failing in so many ways. And so I want to know a little bit about how both of you think that, mainstream sex ed in particular is failing communities of color, and specifically some of the communities that you both represent and are part of.
Um, so how mainstream sex ed fails in general. I guess mainstream sex ed, I start thinking about how we teach sex ed or health education in schools, if you are lucky to have it at all. I think that's really where a lot of people get their first formal education. And then I guess now it's also with social media, right? But for, I guess learning in school, how it fails us. There is really no standardized system to learn health education. There's no standardized curriculum. Any sex educator will tell you that. Even New York City has their own curriculum. I think they're fighting for a little bit more inclusive and better, but it's still lacking. And it's lacking in so many ways because one, there are a bunch of things that you can't talk about in classrooms because it's associated with, whatever Department of Health controls it. Some classrooms it's illegal for me to mention HIV because there are students and this is New York City, there are students who have to sign a waiver, the parents have to sign a waiver, whether or not they can attend a class that mentions the words HIV. You don't even have to talk about sex with HIV, just HIV, and people will be pulled out of the class and you can get sued. And then there are classes where obviously it's still super abstinent only. I think I was pretty lucky. My high school was, I wouldn't say abstinence only at all. We actually learned about like dental dams and oral sex when I was in 6th grade. So I'm really appreciative of that, but it was still pretty in a shameful setting, right? It's like, oh, you only use a dental dam when like you do dirty things or something. But at least I learned what a dental dam was. And I think that in general, the reason why mainstream sex ed fails, communities of color, I think that we don't give enough space for educators who represent the community or peer educators to teach in the classroom. A lot of times educators are coming from the suburbs, are coming from Ivy Leagues, private schools, teaching in schools that may be low income. They may be the only educator that looks like themselves in classrooms full of Black and Brown students. And they're just not culturally competent. And I'll have JV build on that.
Thanks, Sandra. I don't know what kind of language we can have here, but the things that are coming to mind are like everyone's trying to save a hoe. Like I feel like a lot of white educators in sex ed are coming in to really scare people. And my experience with sex ed growing up was in middle school. I was in a Catholic school. So we had this book called Fully Alive. And we really just talked about anatomy and how a pregnancy happens. And then that was it. There were no more conversations that happened. And I think mainstream sex ed, yes, is very white. But even with the educators that we have now, we're still all learning from the same academic book that doesn't have people of color and like a diversity of genitals even. So the conversation really isn't available to represent a lot of folks. Now in working with folks with intellectual and developmental disability, just not only the scare tactic, but also not wanting to admit that people are sexual people, even if they're not having sex, is also, I think, a really foundational part that sex ed fails overall with people.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like what is also coming up for me in terms of, what both of you have mentioned also is that there is so little mention or even hint of like pleasure or joy in the way that we teach people about sex and sexuality. When you were talking about scare tactics, that really spoke to me. And I grew up in New York City, went to pretty progressive schools my whole life. And I think pretty much that's how sex ed was taught to me. And I think, for a lot of people, it's a long time especially for women or people who are gender expansive, before you even come to a place in your life where you're like, oh, this is supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be something that makes me feel good. And so, the theme of this event is decolonizing sex ed. So I want to delve into that a little bit. For both of you, knowing that sex ed can be such a vehicle of white supremacy, what does it mean to decolonize sex ed? What does that look like? How do we do that? How do we do it for ourselves and for our communities?
So this idea of decolonizing, I feel like is like a trendy word that for me, at least, I haven't been exposed to until more recently in my life. But it has so much to do with my life now. So let's see, I'm learning or have begun a process of trying to learn the traditions of my like Indigenous identity, the language of my Indigenous identity. And with sex ed, and when I think about decolonizing sex ed, it's also that admitting that I don't know a lot, that even if we say we're very sex positive, are we also excluding male identified people? Are we excluding asexual people? Are we excluding the practices and beliefs of community? So to me, it means that I'm still learning a lot, and there's so many people that I wish I could learn from. There's some folks that come to mind, La Loba Loca on Instagram. They are one of the first people that brought into a conversation what are some of the things that we grew up with being told by our caretakers. Something like, don't let your feet get cold because you might get sick. Something like, if you wrap your space where your uterus might be, how that might impact your menstrual pain. And then learning just from the perspective of communities that are affected by racism and the health impact of racism. So knowing later in life, and not through sex ed and not through college and not through these conversations, that menstruation is more painful for people who live in communities full of pollution, and that tends to be people of color. So I think it's a lot of knowing that there aren't resources that are validated, that aren't said to be true because they're not white and expensive.
Yeah, I think I had a very similar experience where I got a little nervous about this event because I was like, oh, I didn't learn about sex ed through a decolonizing lens. And then I just realized like no one has, basically. Very few people have. And I guess we're just part of the discussion and just trying to build that. When you talk about decolonization, I think about hegemony, and we kind of talked about that word a little bit in the beginning. And something I want to like maybe expand upon the definition of that is that hegemony in general is basically when a dominant culture is prevalent, right? It could be through like colonization and imperialism, and then it manipulates the other like subcultures that could be around. So I'm thinking the US, obviously, this imperialistic force that is the US, and how it just manipulates all our daily lives and when we don't even know it. So I just really feel that when it comes to sex ed, it just is a lot of unlearning, and anything about decolonization is a lot of unlearning of all those views and all the things that we were taught, just like really hammered into us. So I know that in the spirit of like Asian American feminist collective, I think a lot about Orientalism and how it specifically Asian Americans Asian American femmes and women have been hypersexualized, have been has been hypersexualized, and or like, I guess, I forgot what's the other word, the opposite of hypersexualized, depending on the class, right, or the body size of an Asian American femme or a woman. And then how do we unlearn that when we're talking to our elders and how we're talking to ourselves?
So JV mentioned a little bit about, I think, like some sort of lessons that they'd learned from like people in the community or like from your family. And so I would love to know from both of you, like, who were some of your teachers and, people who continue to be your teachers now when it comes to learning about how to teach and learn about sexuality in a way that's like visionary and radical and inclusive? Who were some of the first people who ever taught you that there was a different way to think about these issues and present them?
So I think experience also let me know I wasn't shit early on in sex ed. When I was interning through the nonprofit Masakani that I still work with, one, that it's not grant-based and that it's not doing evidence-based curriculum is like the most learning that I had as this amazing introduction to sex ed. So going into places where folks that experienced partner violence, maybe were experiencing substance use recovery, or have or were currently in sex work, I think early on let me know that there's a lot for me to learn. And just like any educator or any doctor or anybody that thinks that they're coming in to help somebody out, that I don't know shit. So that like community is the biggest teacher. And yeah, I would say like Masakane as a collective, just young people coming in, the people that I do workshops with, always I hope that it's a conversation where I'm taking something away and it's not just me shouting at people. And of course, I Heart Erica, just so dope. I like love seeing all their stories and everything. Learn a lot.
For me, I think of Poppy Lou on Instagram. I think I found them on Instagram maybe about 3-4 years ago when I was starting out on my abortion support training for my doula training. And I remember doing my doula training, and I was the only Asian person. I was the only person of color really in the room. And I just felt like it wasn't for me. And I didn't know if it was because maybe I was like a really crappy doula and I'm just like not cut out for it. And then I happened upon their Instagram, and they really combined storytelling, especially with abortion, and being a full spectrum doula, and that just changed my whole life. And I was like, I don't have to associate with people that I don't feel like are part of my community, even though it seems like I could, like, this is a place I should be. And then I know that they do work through Ancient Song, which is a birth justice and reproductive justice organization in Brooklyn. And I love them. I love the work that they do. They do a lot of wide spectrum of services for gynecological services. So they're a really great place to check out as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of them as well. I always find that like doulas are just always really cool people. I feel like just very rare that I feel like you can say that about like a profession of people, but I'm like, doulas are always some of the coolest people that I know. So thank you both. You know, I feel like we have spoken a lot about how mainstream sex ed is a failure, really fails people of color, fails young people. And so, you know, I think that we, you know, for me working at Planned Parenthood, we talk about competent and comprehensive sex ed all the time. So I would love to know from both of you, you know, what does culturally competent sex ed look like for communities of color, particularly the communities of color that you serve, and how can we build that?
For me, it's really uplifting community-based educators. So I think that no matter how many trainings that you do in your lifetime, if you are not from that community, there will be some distance from it, which is understandable, and that's completely valid. And I think that it's almost insulting sometimes when people like, I guess we just assume because someone's marginalized that no one from that marginalized group wants to be like a sex educator or like doesn't have aspirations to be. I feel like in this field, it's very easy to kind of tokenize yourself and say like, oh, because I am trained in all this thing that I'm the right person, right educator for this community. So I really think it's building more frameworks and more mentorship and pipelines for communities to elect their own educators I think there's a lot of studies and models out there for peer education. So I really, really advocate for that always.
Really echo what Sandra is sharing, and something else that I'm thinking of now is thinking about what the community looks like. So if you're coming in and talking about like access to healthcare, is that an actually true thing that you're saying? For young people, is this place only open during school time? Do they know if it's actually affordable? Are they going to have to go through insurance? Can they get there through a bus? And maybe some other things that are getting in the way of someone being present during a class, like a lot of just issues in the community, violence in a lot of different forms. So I think that is also part of being culturally competent. And culturally competent to me reads like equity and inclusion, sort of, which again feels like a buzz thing. So Sandra, completely like actually hiring folks and not being gatekeeping by saying you don't have a master's, you don't have a PhD, you don't do this and that, so you're not qualified.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we have spoken a little bit about this, but I do definitely want to spend some time really talking about how queer sex and conversations about gender identity more specifically are basically flat out ignored in most mainstream sex ed curricula. I know that for me, that was definitely the case. And so I would love to hear from both of you, what does competent sex ed look like that speaks to young, queer, trans, and gender expansive people of color about their experiences and the way that they might have sex or understand sexuality?
I am starting to think of my really dear friend and fellow peer educator, Fatmata. They're actually in this Zoom, so hi, Fatmata. I remember that they shared this beautiful workshop with me that was Pleasure in Queer Sex Ed. And because of the way that that organization we worked for didn't enforce an evidence-based curriculum, like JB was saying, we were allowed to really use our expertise and our knowledge and life experience to like curate almost whatever we want. So then when I was going through their PowerPoint, they had images of Packers and sex toys, knowing that that is really important for queer sex ed, especially for young people. You may not know people in your immediate community or area who are also queer and feel safe enough to come out to them, or even like just want to have sex with them. Just because they're both queer, and another person's queer doesn't mean you want to have sex with each other. So seeing that for the first time was like really incredible. So I think like really promoting self pleasure in queer sex ed is really important.
So some of the thing coming up is safety. So I think for all bodies, safety is something that's very important. So I think in the language that I use, if I have to talk about anatomy when it comes to like healthcare, I'll say like a person with a uterus or a person with a penis. And yeah, I think that for me, sex ed, when I talk about it, is a lot about how do we think about our bodies feeling safe in relationships or on our own, because that's like a whole journey, just thinking about what it is that we need, even by ourselves, and how like I also talk about identity being something that can be ever changing, even within a full day. Like consent can change even for that reason, because today I feel this way, because right now at this very moment I feel this way. So I think the work that I do for myself is actually trying to become embodied, and that is part of the sex ed that I hope to share in conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I think both of you also really touch on, how much mainstream sex ed also really enforces binary ways of thinking in so many ways, about gender, about power, about identities. And I know many people close to me who are non-binary or gender expansive, who I think it just takes almost, coming into adulthood, your late 20s, early 30s to even, I think, have the language to be able to explore that and talk about your identity in ways that feel affirming, because we just don't equip young people with those tools. And I would love to hear from both of you in your day-to-day work with community. What do you feel like are some of the biggest challenges that you face as a sex educator of color?
A lot of times I feel like it's not imposter syndrome exactly when you feel like you are not acknowledging the historical harm on communities of color. So even talking about birth control, although it's information that folks can take and decide to use or not and have be the most informed that they can be if they're going to consent to something like using different forms of birth control, um, there's a real like body reaction to sharing about birth control or even telling someone that they can feel safe going to a healthcare provider, knowing that that's not the whole truth, knowing that there's been so much violence in the medical community through medications, through birth control. So I think that's what I combat a lot.
Yeah, I have a very similar answer. I think that there's a lack of nuance that you can't, there's a lack of nuance that's perpetuated by all the things that stop us from being like the sex educator we want to be oftentimes in like a classroom or formal setting. So whether it's at grants, Department of Health, whatever it is, like I think that when you can't talk about nuance, and like for example, someone comes up to me and says that, oh, I'm really scared of having STIs in pregnancy and I won't use a condom. I think in some cases, like the training that we have received says you have to use a condom. And I don't, and I mean, obviously, if you can, if you want to, like that's great. But obviously, if that was the answer to everything, then we wouldn't have sex education as an issue. Um, and like it's really hard to have those nuanced conversations when you're trapped by curricula and policies. Yeah.
Something that has just come up for me through the course of this conversation, as you know, both of you have mentioned sexuality educators on Instagram that you feel like have been doing really great work and reaching a lot of people. I would love to know from both of you how you see the sexuality field changing and how you sort of see some of these digital avenues, particularly for young people and young people of color. You know, how sex ed is sort of expanding and how we're able to do outreach to people, and maybe what you see as, I don't know, some things about that that you feel like are great and awesome, and things about that that you, I don't know, give you pause. Just what are your thoughts on how much the space is changing day to day?
I worry for the censorship that goes on in digital space. But at the same time, I know that a lot of revolutionary moments have happened because of this really fast sharing of information, sharing of experiences for a lot of us, although again, it's very academic and above our heads and expensive to think of these words that we now may identify with. Sometimes, you know, that lends itself to considering that for ourselves. So sharing some words, some experiences that we were not familiar with, I think could be so much of a benefit to young people who have access to the internet. Even though, yes, of course, there's misinformation, I feel like it's better to just have all these different experiences that are out and public and varied.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about like platforms like TikTok because I consume a lot of TikTok. And I think about how young people are really, really engaged with a lot, and they're really exposed to a lot of different types of education now, and it's a lot of different kinds of messaging, um, which is great. And also, I do see like the pitfalls of that. I know that sometimes on Twitter, you'll see a lot of really viral posts that are like, attention, do you know if you take this and this, then this and this will happen? Like, again, there's like no nuance. And like all of those retweets where people kind of correct the information or offer another perspective are all buried because everyone's like kind of alarmed by the urgency of the tweet. And I don't really know how to fix that. I mean, we used to have a workshop. We used to have a workshop where we would dispel myths. And I would take like the most viral, like sex trending tweets and post on Instagram and stuff like that and kind of show them in the class and say like, hey, like, what do you think about this? And kind of have a conversation about it. But it's really hard to do that on a big scale.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also a huge TikTok fan. Definitely feel too old to be there. I'm like on it. I'm like, what is this? Like, how do I go here? I've also recently learned that it's really not cool to have a middle part or have a side part Who knew? And I know they were all like, yeah, it's really not cool to have a side part or to use the crying laughing emoji. They were like, that means you're old. So I was like, okay, well, I'm definitely ancient on this app then. So talking a little bit more about like sex ed in digital spaces, something that I feel like I'm seeing a lot as sort of like, you know, a workaround or antithesis to what we're seeing as, you know, real repression of sex ed, like in our schools and in our institutions more widely. I also think that there's a really burgeoning movement for sex positivity. And I think that's really important to discuss here because, you know, I still feel like so much of the sex positivity movement and the sex positivity activists that I see look like thin white women. And it really feels like the sex positivity movement that I'm seeing in a more mainstream way feels extremely whitewashed. When, you know, we have spent time talking about like ancestral modes of thinking about and understanding sexuality, which we know are so important and have existed for centuries. And so I would love to know from both of you, just how are you thinking about that? How do we counter that? And what does sex positivity actually mean to you?
Are we gonna have to talk about the vagina kung fu thing that happened like last week? I feel like we have to mention that.
Wait, I don't know what this is.
I think a famous, I'm not super like big on Instagram, but like I think a super famous white female sex educator, please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, started having like a sex ed tool. I think it was Kegel balls, and it's like she released this commercial where she is like in a geisha style, ninja style, kung fu style, like all mesh of like, yeah, jade eggs. Yes, there were jade eggs that you can put up your vagina. And she was saying things like, oh, you can do vagina kung fu. If you strengthen your vagina, you can have orgasms. Yes. And it was just a lot of, honestly, I was bothered by it, but it's just so much more bothersome that like people just keep weaponizing a lot of Eastern, like Orientalism to sell their products. And it's like just a form of white supremacy to me. And I know a lot of the comments were kind of like dispelling all the myths that she was having. And it just feels like there's just so much to unpack there that I like don't know how to move forward from it. I think a lot of great Asian American sex educators, a lot of them are on this, a lot of the Zoom, so please follow them. They had amazing takes on it. But yeah, it just seems like Orientalism is so pervasive and it just like goes throughout every part of society and like, I don't know.
I want to believe that after this groundbreaking time in our history where there was Blackout Tuesday, that there are a lot of white people who are now at least feeling called out and accountable to inclusivity or diversity or caring about the violence that happens to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So I hope that in this time that we're living in, where like right now we're meeting virtually, that nothing's ever going to be the same. And I hope that the future really does belong to these conversations that don't have to do with like having a super tight vagina, which like just serves this idea of like patriarchy and has nothing to do with someone's like actual health and ability to relax and receive pleasure alone or with other people. So I think sex positivity to me, because I know that's part of the question. The first part is that I hope everything changes and everything is Black and brown in the future. And that too, sex positivity to me, I think it's just getting to know ourselves in a shame-free aspect. And again, really thinking about like, what are the biases that I have as an educator for 10 plus years? What are the things that I still need to work through, whether it's how I talk about my own body, how I see my body, how I've really fed into the ideas that I've been given about how sex should look like or what I should look like.
I just want to quickly add about that. Yeah, I remember there was this term, body neutrality, that was, I think had a lot of traction a few years ago. And I wonder if we could also bring that to sex ed. And I think that people have already had those concepts. I just haven't heard the term like neutrality in my life. But you know, it's also just like maybe like sex positivity doesn't just mean being like toxic positive, right? Like over sex. Like you don't have to have sex with every single person you see to be sex positive, and you also can have zero sex to be like it's literally sex positivity is literally just having a neutral or positive attitude towards sex. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really like thinking about it as sort of analogous to body neutrality, you know, because there are a lot of parts of sex and sexuality that are incredibly painful or difficult or take time to work through, that require unlearning, that require relearning. And so I totally agree with you. And I think a wider movement for sex positivity means really embracing a lot of that messiness. As opposed to just being like, you know, everyone should just be fucking all the time. And, you know, we know that it's a lot deeper than that. So we've touched on this a little bit, but I do want to talk a little bit more specifically, you know, about how non-Western perspectives and practices when it comes to sexuality, we really see them as either being derided or flat out ignored. And I would love to know from both of you, like, what are some important lessons that you've learned in your own explorations of ancestral knowledge or teachings around sexuality, either from your own families or your communities?
So coming into sex ed and trying to gain a little bit of layers to it, another sort of process or learning that I've gone through is I did a yoga training that was trauma informed, and that helped inform how I feel like an education setting should be, where there's like no surprises, folks have dependability, we're thinking about every person in the room is coming with their own set of experiences. So I don't know why I went there, but I'll skip ahead to what I was thinking originally. This is a huge trigger warning. This is going to refer to sexual violence, but there's some learning that I'm going through about sexual trauma. That's where it connects. About sexual trauma and what ancestrally, or not even ancestrally, because we are still here as Indigenous people, is a practice. So folks who may experience sexual violence can go through ceremony to invite the soul back into the body, because going through sexual violence is something that can and believed to be something that the soul leaves the body because of, to preserve itself. So that's not something that I'm going to talk about in a sex ed, in general sex ed classroom, when I'm talking about like getting a chest exam. But it's something that I think for me is important to contextualize what in academia, in like at first majoring in like psychology, would have us feel is depression or anxiety that we carry with us, or disassociation. And again, coming back to like the embodiment that can be part of our sexuality, again, with ourselves, with other people.
Thank you for sharing, JB. Something that I'm trying to do is not see my culture and my heritage like as something completely different from the work I do, which is often sometimes I have to do because there's not a lot of spaces that are, I guess, Thai only, Mon only, Teo Chow only. And it's really easy to kind of just tokenize myself and say, oh, all that stuff, that's just home stuff, if you think about that on your off time. And one of those concepts I'm trying to bring into my life more is Metta, which is a Buddhist concept of I guess like radical acceptance and forgiveness, and that can be applied to other people and it could be applied to yourselves. And I think about how you can apply that to so many things, like abolition. That has been the main reason why abolition hasn't been like the most foreign concept to me, because like in Metta you think about that. And for sex ed, and just also like forgiving yourselves. And I wouldn't say forgiving as in like you have to forgive like trigger warning, like abusers or anything, but just accepting what you can control in your life and what you can do for yourself and for others. I think it's a pretty important practice that I think anyone could do.
Thank you both for sharing those things. I would love to learn more about that. So, we have talked a little bit about how for so many of us, we spend, huge parts of our adult lives unlearning lessons that we have inherited from growing up in a white, cis, hetero patriarchy. And, I'd love to know from both of you, like, what do you think are some of maybe the most prominent lessons that you have unlearned as a sexuality educator or are still in process of unlearning? And what did that process look like for you?
I think for me, a lot of like the cultural like trauma and shame has kind of made me in my youth completely reject a lot of the things that are my culture. So I'm trying to reclaim that back and see it from a more nuanced view. And I'm not gonna like trash on little Sandra for doing that, because I think I need to dismiss myself from that to unlearn shame and like really be um and like just like love myself more and like prioritize more. I think now that I am a little bit further from that part of my life, I am able to acknowledge that I can meet some things halfway with my culture. And I think a lot about like I just recently moved out with my partner, which is like a big no-no to my family. I think I'm like my family makes me feel like I'm the first person to ever do this in my life before someone gets married. And I just know that's probably not true, because there's a long lineage of my ancestors and one of them has to have done this before. And then one thing my mom said to me was like, oh my God, if your grandma and your grandpa were alive, like they would be so ashamed of you. And that like hurt me so much. And I felt like, but I did try to do that thing where I was like, okay, actually, I don't care. Like, I didn't say fuck the ancestors, but like who cares if they don't care? But then I realized like during the middle of the night, I would like subconsciously take a pillow and like put it between me and my partner, like to like separate myself. And I was just like, I'm clearly embodying the shame. Like, how do I meet this? And in another time, I would have never confronted my mom about that. But I told her, I was like, are you really like that ashamed of me for like doing what I needed to do? And then she corrected herself, she explained it. But if I didn't have that explanation, I would have just held myself. So
I want to say, so the anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous part of my family and my culture is super embedded in not admitting that we have queer ancestors and not admitting having multiple gender and spirit within us. So that's one thing. In sex ed in general, I want to feel like more and more, I hope that other people and myself can learn to trust ourselves in our bodies, because our bodies are usually taken to, like the experts of our bodies are this article on eating these smoothie bowls, or only this doctor can tell you what you feel in your body. So I think one thing that I want to unlearn and do is to trust myself and trust the knowledge and know that there is a lot of truth that's hidden because of colonization, whether it has to do with our queer ancestors or how much of the messages we and our people before us that were teaching us are actually rooted in anti-Blackness.
Thank you both for sharing. We are going to kick it over to audience Q&A in just a second, but I do want to ask one more question, which is, what are some things that each of us can do in our own lives to become more attuned to our own desires, to ourselves as sexual beings, and to center pleasure in our own lives? Uh-oh, JV, we can't hear you if you're talking.
I was saying, go ahead, Sandra. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. So in that moment, oh, what can we do to center pleasure? We mentioned previously, sex positivity can be like just positivity can be a negative thing. We're going through a pandemic and we're going through a housing crisis, and there's so much fear and anxiety every single day that for me personally, one thing that I find is not wanting to expect myself to even be content every day or find pleasure every day. But one of the things that has been difficult for me growing up as a first generation person and as like the daughter figure, the caretaker for my family, has been to become the cement person that can't let this out because they don't need that on top of everything that my family is going through. They don't need for me to be upset about something, to be stressed out about something. So that has leaked into so many things, intimate relationships, less so with friends, but it's when someone gets extremely close that I'm like, all right, this is another person that can't see me open up. And it's something that in therapy I talk about, because it becomes harder and harder to open up and let yourself cry even when you're by yourself. So I think pleasure for me lately has been when I'm able to cry, when I'm able to admit how much is going on, how heavy things are. So yeah, there is a pleasure to that like that crying and thinking about a saying that I have heard is the tears, especially of a femme person, are blessings and prayers back to earth. So that's one way I look at it now.
Oh, that just gave me chills. Yeah, I think I'll kind of build on that and say like just to like listen to yourself and know what you and be okay with what you want. I know that sometimes in sex ed there are very concrete things, right? Like I don't know, like sometimes there's very concrete messaging that you may hear, like STDs are bad. Like, why are we saying that and why are we saying that to ourselves? And I know that a lot of times people will come to me and say like, oh, this person has an STI, like, sorry, I said STD before, STI, like, should I have sex with them or not? And it's like, what, like, let's unpack why you feel like this is not a good thing for you to do. And basically it just comes around to safety. My friend likes to say that I'm very safety conscious, which I feel like is a really good word for me. Because I know that when I feel safe, that's when I am able to feel the most pleasure in my life. And that's regarding everything. That even applies to COVID right now. So like knowing that when like kind of letting yourself know what's the definition of safe, right? Everyone doesn't have the same definition. There are things that are, nothing is really safe in general. Like we have to think about what is safer and what we can do that's safest for ourselves. And be okay with that. Maybe it is maybe it's incorporating a lot of harm reduction into your life. And that is the best thing that you could possibly do to set your pleasure.
Thank you so much. I have chills from both of you. Thank you. That was really amazing knowledge to drop. So thank you. I'm going to invite our participants. Thank you so much for also just like participating in the chat. It's been great. Feel free to just put your questions in the chat. We're collecting them. I'm going to start off with a couple that have been asked earlier in the event. And yeah, everyone just feel free to keep putting your questions in the chat as we go. So the first question, I know that JV spoke a little bit about this explicitly, especially in reference to the work that you do, but we have a question about like the intersections of disability, illness, chronic pain, and sex ed. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I can't take full credit because I feel like any of the things that I absorb and want to incorporate in sex ed conversations come from people who are really experiencing disability, who are really experiencing anti-Blackness, who are really experiencing fat phobia, who are really experiencing a lot of things that in a lot of my privileges, I don't necessarily experience. So I think one thing that has come up recently in a panel that I was watching yesterday was that with COVID, a lot of folks may now be considered disabled. So to think about the society that we live in as a place that is not, does not lend itself to anyone who can't be as productive as possible, who can't gain money for our system. So I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the question. It's with disability, go ahead.
It was
Redo.
just like about like
Mhm.
the intersections of disability, illness, chronic pain, and sex
Mhm.
ed, and maybe how you approach your sex ed practice, you know, approaches that intersection.
Yes. So even when sharing about consent, one thing that we could do with, again, just this idea that I always carry with me of we're just talking about what it feels like to be in our bodies and figure out ways of communicating that, is that disability can be invisible. A disability that I have and I was born with means that spontaneous sex with another person can't really happen because I'm more prone to infections because of a kidney disorder I was born with. So being able to communicate that, being able to communicate, I have to really not, I have to shower immediately, or you have to really like be super hygienic, and some things that feel a little embarrassing and may be like it might break the mood is part of a disability experience that I have, but also thinking about how just like in consent, just how we feel every day, our identity changes and is so fluid. Even the anxiety of waiting for an STI test result can be something that at that moment is a medical experience or a body experience, something that we are health-wise anxiety feeling can impact our sexuality and our ability to communicate or whether or not we want to be sexual with other people, forgiving ourselves if we ourselves are not feeling like sexual people. I think that although it may not seem like disability, I think is just giving ourselves grace and space to know that we don't have to meet anyone's expectation, and that goes for ourselves and the messages that we tell ourselves.
Thank you. Sandra, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I think that one of like the most revolutionary things I've heard was that dirty talk is a form of consent and like boundary negotiation. And I was like, this is so true. Like we tend to think about consent in very like monotonous, boring, or like not a part of sex really. You just think about it before sex. I think that something I always like to talk about with my own friends is that like pleasure is centered before, during, and after sex. So at any point of that where you feel uncomfortable or you don't like what how can we change that if it's in your control? Because I've had a lot of friend experiences where it's like, oh, I know I shouldn't have done that, but I've done it anyway because like I didn't want to ruin the moment, or like, and like not even in terms of regretting what they did, but just it's just not like being able to center themselves in that moment. And then like or like when people regret maybe their safety options, right? And then they're really freaking out about it afterwards. And then what they don't realize is that, you know, like sex is whatever amount of time it is. But then now you're spending days, weeks, months really just worrying about this one encounter. So like how can you also incorporate that as your mindset? Like this is also a part of the sexual experience.
Thank you. We have a question that asks, what's the difference between an inclusive sexual education and a decolonized sexual education? And is this a US oriented perspective because colonialisms vary?
Sorry, what was the last part? With what perspective?
Is this a US oriented perspective because colonialisms vary?
Got it. I think.
But the first part of the question was about, sorry, just the comparing and contrasting inclusive versus decolonized sex ed.
Yeah. I think we kind of spoke about before how the word decolonize has been thrown around a lot, and I feel like we can talk about decolonization forever because this is a topic that you have to really. It's a framework. It's a mindset. It's every daily action you do is to consider yourself as a decolonizer or to be a part of that movement. It's not just one time. It's not just one lesson that you teach. It's a community that you build around you. It's the structures that you help dismantle. And it's a very powerful word. I would even say that in the work I do is decolonizing, just because like I am still working within structures. And I think me and JV were talking about nonprofits and the nonprofit industrial system and how we're kind of low key. We're all trapped in this. We're all trapped in this if you don't want to go over to the corporate world. So I think that decolonization involves a lot of that. unlearning and dismantling, and also just always uplifting Black and Indigenous communities to the front and perspectives to the front. And inclusive sexual education, I think it's kind of like the bare minimum of what we should aim for. So kind of what we've been talking about before.
Mhm.
100%. I just want to be like, yeah, I was snapping and I was hoping you could almost hear Sandra. Yeah, inclusive can be a bare minimum of don't use gendered language, or the picture that you're now seeing also has pubic hair, or it has a tan. Like that's a bare minimum. I don't think decolonization is possible under academic structures, including sex ed.
Thank you. This question, I think, came up, Sandra, when you were talking about your family and some of the struggles that you had when you decided to live with your partner. And so the question is, how would you recommend POC parents and future parents stop the intergenerational trauma and shame around sex and sex ed?
If I knew, I would have a better relationship with my parents. I wouldn't have had to move out. But I do think that there hasn't been I won't say that. I think that when we talk about sex ed, and like, I am a younger person, so I would say a lot of the people I associate with were younger, or maybe child free. So I don't work with as many parents on a one-on-one level with that. But I think that sometimes we always talk about sex ed as this is something that you don't discuss with your parents, or just something as like in opposition to what your parents say. Meanwhile, I think a lot of parents are willing to learn, and just kind of breaking down that perspective where like I think we paint a lot of pictures where it's like all Muslim parents are strict, or all Asian parents are strict and hate their daughters, or something like that. I think that doesn't leave a lot of room for the growth that they could possibly do, and like safely do. I think one of the best things I read was like the conversation you wrote for your article, Senti, with your mom, and how she said that I didn't, forgive me, I'm misquoting, but it's like she didn't teach you a lot of sex ed because she just didn't have the tools to do that. It wasn't out of a malicious intent. And I think that sometimes I'm talking from like a very traumatized child point, but like I've never thought that could be possible of my mom. And then after I read that, I actually talked to her about it. I was like, why do you teach me all these things that are wrong? And then she was saying how she just didn't know, and she thought was right, and she just cared about me being safe. So I would have never thought about that if I didn't read like positive parent stories learning.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, I was thinking about that sort of throughout the course of our conversation, something that we didn't totally touch on, but we definitely still can. Sex ed for adults, for older people, we always think about sex ed as existing for young people, but we know that people require sex ed at every stage of their lives. But for the audience, I met Sandra when I interviewed her for an article that I was writing that was about the need for sex ed in Asian American communities. And I interviewed my mom for it, who didn't teach me any sex ed. And, through like looking through a lot of research and statistics, it was very clear that there is just almost no information, in different languages that's culturally competent, that's aimed at immigrant parents for doing sex ed at home. And that's also like a real failing of our system. Again, that also really affects people of color. JV, did you have anything that you wanted to say about being able to sort of break this cycle of silence and trauma that many of us have maybe grown up with in our own households?
I'm lucky in that I get to speak to people who take care of younger people, and I think have conversations that maybe they weren't able to have with my mom. She's my best friend. We've had really difficult conversations. I have a great story where my mom found a vibrator while she was driving me to work and showed me right before I was going into work. And my first reaction about now having to have this conversation was like, I paid money for that. I can't believe, oh, actually she threw it out. And she was like, I found something and I threw it out because it's the wrong thing to have. So I was like, I'm upset because that was my money that I worked for. We're going to talk about this after. And that felt like a moment where I'd flipped around a conversation that typically was being talked at. But it's really that moment finding my vibrator has dildo actually has been able to give us so many more conversations. And although we don't always agree, I feel like it is coming from really similar places. Immigrating from a place where, I mean, no matter where you are, there's a fear for femme folks, but maybe feeling like policy-wise, there's even less protection where you're coming from, means that like you really want to make sure that your children are safe. And even thinking about like waiting until marriage comes from maybe, and this is just me projecting, I have no idea, like my mother being in a marriage where there was financial support, but maybe not as much thinking about like pleasure and intimacy and a lot of other things that were coming from that. So I think, again, financial safety, any kind of safety that can be shared through passing down these scary monster stories have been huge. But our conversations have super duper expanded, and I really appreciate it, even if we don't always agree. Like one story, she told me that she went outside and wasn't wearing a bra, but she still opened the door for the mailman. And I felt like that was her way of being like, I listened to these conversations and look at this funny thing that I can share with you now.
Yeah,
Sorry,
definitely.
add real quick. Yeah, I think a lot of times our parents are trying to stop that intergenerational trauma we were talking about in their own ways. Maybe it causes more trauma, definitely, almost. Because I think about my mom, who she was pretty much shunned by a lot of her community members for marrying someone who was much older. My biological father is an indigenous, dark-skinned man, and she was shunned for that. And she really just wanted me not to have the same experience. So instead of being like, oh, those people are messed up and we shouldn't listen to them, it's like, you have to do this and this and this to avoid that.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I also think something else that, we can definitely do that I think, I've read a lot of things about how I think this is sort of more of a sex ed model, like in Europe or other countries, but just where, sex ed is implemented like age appropriately into many different parts of education. So, in this country, if you are lucky enough to have sex ed in your school, you're probably not going to get it until middle school, maybe early high school. But, for us in our own families, if we choose to parent, having things like teaching our 4-year-olds about consent and about touch, about good touch, bad touch, just like working up to a place where then your child has comfort with you to be able to talk about these things and about their body to a point where maybe at the time that they're ready to have sex, they really feel like they can come to you and they have a space to be able to share in that with you. I have a question that says, I turned 18 relatively recently and I'm interested in trying dating apps just to see what the hype is about and maybe to have some fun. But I'm hesitant both because I'm so young and because I'm Asian and more femme presenting. Do JV or Sandra have any insight into the role of dating apps in the landscape of sex ed, or just personal advice? I really love this question.
Go ahead.
I almost want to be like, Senti, you want in on this? Because I have been on dating apps for a short time. Somewhat of a serial dater, you might call me. So dating apps have been fun, but have also been a space where if eventually I did meet someone, it didn't mean that I didn't have boundaries crossed just because of the kind of work that I do. And yeah, I think with unfortunately, whether it's an online space or in person, but it feels like online it's quicker. There's a chance that someone can fetishize. There's a chance that someone may, cross a boundary and do something that, is violating to you through a virtual space. So I can't really say much about it. It also has been fun to meet a lot of different people and say, like, click off the things that I think are important to me, at least in that time.
Yeah, Senti, you should go. I wouldn't say I'm a serial monogamist, but I have been in one monogamous relationship for like my whole life. So since I was like 14. So I can't talk on dating apps, but I will say that I love swiping for my friends. And I think the one thing that they get a lot of burnout from being on dating apps too long. So just like protect your spirit and like happy birthday.
I do think protect your spirit is really great advice in dating, regardless of how you're doing it. I feel like firstly, my advice would be like, please be safe because it's COVID. So go out for socially distanced walks and like have a lot of conversations with people about their safety level, and how often they're getting tested and all of that stuff before you meet up. But I don't know, I think like dating apps are really fun. I kind of think like it's really amazing that we live in a time where we're able to expand our social circle so much. Like, I think use it as an opportunity to like explore your sexuality and also like your own, just like who you are, what you're interested in. Like, the more that we date, the more we're kind of gathering information about the kinds of people that we want to be, that we're interested in. I would say like, don't take it too seriously. Be really honest with people about what you're looking for and what you can give and what you want. And don't ghost people. Okay, I think we have a couple more questions. Any tips for advocating for larger systemic changes within schools?
No, no, I do have tips. I feel like something that people should know is that your educators don't have a lot of power at all. A lot of the work comes from school admin, which is really hard to navigate. If you have a specialty, or if you can find someone with a specialty of navigating bureaucracy and navigating like all the things to get meetings with that one person, which most likely, like, I don't know, school supervisor, superintendent, whatever the title is, I think that's where you can make the most, I guess, movement. Yeah, I think that a lot of the work, I think what JV and I touched on before was that a lot of the work that you can do, it doesn't have to be within the school structure. It doesn't have to be within an academic structure. And it feels really hard. I just graduated like 2-3 years ago. So it feels really hard when you're in the moment, if you're in school or academia, that there's life outside of it, but there really is. And I feel that that's where you might feel a lot more of you might like find more comfort there.
Agree. Unfortunately, we have a lot of health teachers that also are still teaching sex ed. So hopefully this turns into like a policy change, where there's one, like admitting that there are people like this is their work. Sexuality education is their work. And what we've been talking about this whole time is people who reflect community, that are coming in to do it. So I would hope that it's like a big policy change. And even like my advice as someone who's been in like after school programs and done all the things that have even been like grant funded is, even though there's a script, when I knew I wasn't going to get in trouble for it, I would not do the script, and I would still try to open it up to as much information as possible, but also remember that it's a conversation and it's not a math class necessarily. It's people at whatever age just being able to ask their questions and share their experiences, because that may be one of the first times that they're going to be opening up that conversation for themselves too, and with the people in their community.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question, and then we are going to wrap it up, unless we can also see if anybody has like a last question. We can definitely see if we can squeeze it in. I'd love to know from both of you advice that you have for people who might be interested in wanting to become sexuality educators themselves, or also just for people who are more who are interested in getting more involved in movements for sexual liberation. Where can they start?
I think it's being very cognizant of what you want to do and where you're coming from. For example, I've always come from a point of like health related professions. Like I am, like, oh, it's weird to say, like I'm going to be a doctor. I just got into med school like 2 weeks ago. So like, thanks. So like I feel like where sex ed was really like, I love being a sex educator, but where I found my strength was being a service provider. So like being an abortion care provider. And I think it took a lot of work to get there, because it's really hard to say like, it's really hard in the beginning to start out, and when people try to kind of put you in boxes, like if you're a sex educator, you can only do this, you can only do that. So just try to come, like, I guess, channel your strengths, and you'll find community when you do that.
I echo finding community and networking being this huge thing. I was sort of self-taught through Masekane, but then also going through and paying for scholarships and applying to go to conferences, and then still having a traumatic experience and seeing like 230 thin white women as educators that would like question where my education comes from, why am I an educator, how did I become an educator, what means I'm a good educator. So knowing that there's still community outside of that, which is really dope that we're having this conversation. And also knowing that there isn't one path, because I hope that sex education isn't forever going in, everybody has to go to Widener, because even that experience has been echoed time and time again to be a colonized, awful experience for a lot of people. So just know that there are other outlets, and like Sandra's saying, whatever the thing is, getting to know yourself. Maybe you're an artist, maybe you're someone that's really comfortable on camera, and you know, like supporting your friends, because your friends are the ones that are gonna get you on these other platforms.
Thank you both so much. This has been a really awesome, amazing conversation. I feel like I've learned so much just sitting here and speaking with both of you. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And can you let people know how they can keep in touch with you and your work?
I forgot my Twitter user. I'm trying to find my account. So I think you can keep up with me on Twitter because I'm more active and I'm public on there. I'm very jealous of every Instagram sex educator because I could never do that. I'm just not skilled enough at social media to do this. So you can follow me on Twitter. I put it in the chat.
Awesome. And I saw that JV put the Instagram handle in there as well. So Tiff, do you mind sharing our slide that we have? So JV and Sandra put together a list of some really great organizations who are doing really cool, radical, visionary work in the sexuality and sexual liberation space. So we invite you to donate to these mutual aid efforts and organizations and grassroots groups if you can. Follow them, support them, learn more about the work that they're doing. And if you have groups that are doing amazing work in the sexuality space that are led by people of color, queer, trans people, please put them in the chat. We would love to learn more about the kinds of work that you're all supporting and learning about. And thank you everybody so much for coming tonight. I'm going to pass it off to Tiff to wrap us up. Oh, Tiff, you're muted.
Yes, I'm back.
There you go.
Yeah, so let me move it over. Yeah, thank you everyone again, just echoing Senti for joining us. This has been a great space. I've learned a lot. And it's, you know, very liberating to get to hear about people talking about sexuality in a way that makes me feel not traumatized. So yeah, keep in touch with Aafc on Instagram, Twitter. We have a pretty not happening Facebook right now, and tiny letter. We have a few projects that are ongoing and coming up. For example, we have our Black and Asian Solidarities, Feminist Solidarities project, which is published on Asian American Writers Workshops, The Margins. That's a ongoing collaboration between us and Black women radicals, just exploring and analyzing cross-racial feminism, as well as we're collecting resources to share out on alternatives for policing in light of the more recent wave of anti-Asian hate crimes. So please reach out to us on Instagram or Twitter. We put some calls out on there. If you have any resources from anywhere across the country that you would want to share with us, that includes, mutual aid, neighborhood patrols that don't, involve police, or, volunteering to walk elders or buy groceries. Just, anything that you can think of that can just, be a transformative or restorative justice alternative to policing. And yeah, feel free to, if you would like to, donate to us. It's paypal.me/AAF Collective, or you can go to our website, asianamfeminism.org, and you can learn more there as well as donate. So yeah, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And if anyone else on the panel has anything to say, I'll just let everyone unmute and say bye.
Thank you both so much. This has been really awesome. I really appreciate all the work that you both do. So thank you so much, and congratulations on med school.
Oh my God, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everybody, for spending the time here. I appreciate everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.